Thank you, John. Your Excellencies, Father Gruner, Reverend Fathers, and ladies and gentlemen, it is truly an honor, a humbling honor for me to be here today to address you. This has been a wonderful conference, so many good speakers and many inspiring messages about the most important message of our era. And so we thank particularly Father Gruner. I've been with him for many years, for over 3 decades, when he was launching in his early days out in California. And I've been able to be at a few of his conferences, and it's truly wonderful to be here this week with you. Our Lady of Fatima, pray for us. Do we have no, there we go, let's put it on. Okay, we're up and running. Conquest through convergence. Russia is spreading her errors now more than ever. 1917. We are fast approaching the 100th anniversary of the most momentous year of our modern age. It's the centenary of the pivotal point in mankind's history. You are all very much aware from all of the excellent speakers who addressed you earlier that in that year, 1917, 96 years ago, the world was given a choice between heaven and hell. The Lord our God, the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the Creator and Sustainer of all things visible and invisible, sent the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Mother of our Lord Jesus Christ, with a message to 3 shepherd children in Fatima, Portugal. The message was simple, calling for prayer and penance for the innumerable sins that grievously offend God and that were responsible at that time for a great world war. And the Blessed Virgin Mary let it be known that God wanted the Pope and the Catholic bishops of the world to consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart. If that was not done, Russia would spread her errors throughout the world. When the Blessed Mother first appeared to the children, Russia was still a Christian nation. So the meaning of Russia will spread her errors was not immediately obvious. Within mere months, it would become painfully obvious to millions. Before the year was out, hell had unleashed its fury in Russia. The satanically evil world revolution that had been unleashed more than a century earlier in 1789 in the French Revolution now roared back into full view. The Bolsheviks under V.I. Lenin established the first durable revolutionary communist socialist regime and secured a safe haven from which to launch their global subversion. How can strict unity of will be ensured? By thousands subordinating their will to the will of one, so declared Lenin, as reported in his Vestia, the communist publication, on April 28, 1918. All must submit their wills, their entire beings, to the collective will of the party, the state, and of course, to the will of the dictators who exercise the power of the party and the totalitarian state. To carry out the consolidation of total power, Lenin relied on Iron Felix, the head of Lenin's secret police, the Cheka, Felix Dzerzhinsky. Dzerzhinsky said, "We represent in ourselves organized terror." The Cheka, he said, stood for organized terror. Lenin said, "A good communist is at the same time a good Chekist." He said that in an address to the Ninth Party Congress. Now, what does it mean to be a good Chekist? It's very important because we see it even today. Putin calls on his men to be good Chekists. What does it mean to be a good Chekist? It means that one is a vigilant defender of the communist revolution, rooting out any thought crimes in one's own thinking, as well as carefully watching, spying on one's family, neighbors, co-workers for any criticism of or deviation from the party line and the party program. Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, the heroes, the false gods of Marxist-Leninists the world over, were two of the most deranged, misanthropic individuals ever to have lived. Marx's comrade and co-author of the Communist Manifesto, Friedrich Engels, wrote of his comrade Marx that he was, quote, "a monster possessed by 10,000 devils," end quote. And if we had time, I could run through some of the characteristics and anecdotes that caused Engels to say this of his friend. Communism, or Marxism-Leninism, the ideology of Karl Marx, developed further by Vladimir Lenin, to which was also added Lenin's organizational structure of the Communist Party, called for exercising total, unrestricted power, iron discipline, and merciless terror. The world had seen countless tyrants throughout history, but never before the demonic fury against Christianity and all religion that would be manifested by the communist dictatorship of the proletariat and the satanic will to remake man in a whole new image. But it spread, unlike anything previously in all of history, and soon had engulfed most of the world. Here's the Marxist-Leninist pantheon. You see there Marx and Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. There are many posters like this. This is what are put up as icons in the communist, so-called atheist state for the people to worship. Now, Lenin said in his book, Religion, quote, "Atheism is a natural and inseparable part of Marxism, of the theory and practice of scientific socialism," end quote. The Reverend Richard Wurmbrand, who's was an evangelical Protestant minister, he's since died about a decade or so ago. He was incarcerated and tortured for 14 years in communist Romania. His book, Tortured for Christ, has been around for many years and a very important work. But he has revealed some very important information that sheds a different light on communist atheism. Wurmbrand cites evidence showing that Marx and other communist leaders were not unbelievers, that is, they did not disbelieve in God, but they were haters of God. Now, an atheist doesn't hate God, because if one is truly an atheist, God doesn't exist. And hating something that doesn't exist is a waste of time and energy and doesn't make any sense. But many communists quite evidently do believe, but they defy and resent and hate God. Now, a number of the things that Reverend Wurmbrand brings out in his book, Marx and Satan, are some of Marx's writings, his poems, for instance. And I'm going to just share with you a couple of them. They're really quite frightening when you ponder them, but it helps one to understand that we are not dealing simply with human powers here. Many of these people are in the grip of devils. Here's one of Marx's poems. Thus heaven I've forfeited, and I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell. In another poem, he said, with disdain I throw my gauntlet full in the face of the world and see the collapse of this pygmy giant, whose fall I will not stifle my ardor. Then will I wander godlike and victorious through the ruins of the world, and giving my words an active force, I will feel equal to the Creator. Not surprisingly, this raging hatred against God and man resulted in a brand of lethal politics that rose to genocide on a scale never before imagined. And Lethal Politics is the title of a major study by Professor R.J. Rummel. The full title is Lethal Politics, Soviet Genocide and Mass Murder Since 1917. This came out in 1987, I believe. This book, this study by Professor Rummel, provides a chilling view of the horrendous global killing fields brought to us by the Marxist-Leninist revolution, that great revolution that was supposed to aid the downtrodden, or so its adherents claimed at the time. But it gave us instead, as Professor Rummel said, democide. Democide is a term that he coined to deal with this incomprehensible level of killing. He said, democide is a government's concentrated, systematic, and serial murder of a large part of its population. Professor Rummel pointed out that independent of war and other kinds of conflicts, governments probably have murdered 119,400,000 people. Marxist governments, about 95,200,000 of them. By comparison, the battle killed in all foreign and domestic wars in this century total 35,700,000. Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin put into practice, which we see in these figures, the kind of corruption that Lord Acton warned about in his famous dicta. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we see in every communist state absolute corruption from the use of absolute power. Eugene Lyons, one of the many young pro-Soviet American socialists, went to Lenin's People's Paradise, Russia, as a journalist propagandist right around 1920. He eventually awoke to the totalitarian reality of the Soviet Union, and he became a fierce anti-communist critic. He wrote of the Soviet regime, quote, "Never before has a regime spawned such gigantic organs of surveillance, denunciation, punishment, censorship, and intimidation." End quote. Lenin had a fiendishly diabolical obsession to force all humanity to submit to the divine will of the Communist Party as dictated by himself and his revolutionary vanguard. Lenin said, quote, "We are going to destroy everything, and on the ruins we will build our temple." Destruction, that's what the revolution was all about. The results of Dr. Rummel's exhaustive investigation in Lethal Politics can be ignored only at the peril of every living being on this planet. The shocking conclusion of the professor's meticulous research is mind-numbing. Professor Rummel found that, quote, "Independent of war and other kinds of conflicts, governments have murdered, as we said, 119,400,000 people. He said, "These monstrous statistics sharply reoriented my research. For more than 30 years as a political scientist and peace researcher, I had focused my research on the causes and conditions of war, conflict, and peace. I had believed that war was the greatest killer and that nuclear war would be a global holocaust. Now I have found that the total killed by government in cold blood was almost 4 times that of war. It was as though a nuclear war had already occurred." End quote. The Cold War body count alone is at least 22.5 million. That is from the end of World War II, after the war, to 1978. That's the number of human beings murdered by Soviet communists during that period. To describe this phenomenon, Professor Rummel came up with the term democide. For Soviet democide alone, Rummel arrived at, quote, "the most probable estimate of 61,911,000 murdered," end quote. This conservative estimate, he pointed out, is more than 4 times the battlefield dead. For still another quantitative perspective, the professor reported that from 1918 to 1953, the Soviet government executed, slaughtered, starved, beat, or tortured to death, or otherwise killed some 39.5 million of its own people. In China, under Mao Zedong, the communist government eliminated 45 million people. The number killed in just these 2 nations is about 84.5 million, or a lethality of 252% more than both world wars together. Yet, asks Rummel, have the world community and intellectuals generally shown anything like the same horror or outrage over these Soviet and Chinese mega killings as has been directed at the much less deadly world wars? Now, these figures, horrendous as they are, do not begin to tell the whole story. Quantitatively, it is very likely that they err on the low side. Rummel, for instance, in his books, and he's written a number of them, say they probably underestimate by at least 10%. And he gives reasons why he didn't include many other figures that would have bumped it up tens of millions more. But then there is the qualitative perspective. It is impossible for raw statistics to convey the immeasurable mental, physical, and spiritual agonies suffered by each one of those millions of souls who were starved, tortured, executed, or otherwise disposed of as if they were nothing more than so much debris. Furthermore, and Rummel points this out quite emphatically, he says, quote, "These figures do not measure the misery among those loved ones left behind, the mothers, the fathers, the husbands or wives, the children's friends, the lovers of those killed. No accounting is made of those who died of heartbreak, who gave up on life, who succumbed to disease or privation, or whose remaining years were full of anguish and bitterness," end quote. All of this horrendous record of annihilation and desolation can be attributed, said Rummel, to utopia empowered, the melding of an idea and power. The scientific concept of dictatorship, said Lenin, means nothing else but this: power without limit, resting directly upon force, restrained by no laws, absolutely unrestricted by rules, end quote. Now, I'm a journalist, have been for nearly 40 years, and one of my passions has been to find as many people who have been victims of communist regimes, of totalitarianism, those who have escaped, who have come here. I have traveled in some communist countries and attended communist conferences on communist atrocities around the world. I am our official accredited reporter at the United Nations and have been for 3 decades. They don't like me there. They try to keep me out. They try to keep me. They try to take away my accreditation, but I've been able to be there. And I have been able to interview many of the survivors of the gulags, from the Soviet gulags, from China, from Cuba, from many of these people who are not just statistics, they are real people who have real stories to tell. And I have many of their interviews online and videotapes of them. Professor Rummel wrote a number of books expanding on that first book, Lethal Politics. One is Death by Government. Another one is Democide, about the Nazi genocide. Then he has one specifically on China called China's Bloody Century. On his website, he then goes into much more detail on others, including the Cambodian genocide. These are just some of the victims, the skulls and bones of some of the millions, almost 2 million Cambodians who were destroyed by the Khmer Rouge communists in Cambodia. You may not be aware, most Americans are not, that this is a very important year right now. 2012, 2013, it's the 80th anniversary of Holodomor, the Soviet Union's genocide through forced famine of the Ukraine, 1932 to 1933. 5 to 7 million people murdered in genocide in one of the most cruel ways possible, by forced starvation. There are many books and videos that have been made on this. Our mass media has tried to ignore it. At the time, they covered it up. They said it wasn't happening. The New York Times got a Pulitzer Prize for Walter Duranty, the communist reporter, who denied that this was even happening. It was being done by our good buddy, Joe Stalin, who became our great ally, we are told, in World War II. We're told we couldn't have won World War II without him, that he was a terrible enemy of Hitler's. But, of course, people who argue that have forgotten about the Hitler-Stalin Pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. What you see there is the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact on August 23, 1939. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov is signing the agreement. Directly behind him is Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, standing under the photo portrait of Lenin. And of course, right next to him, in the light-colored suit there, is Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. Defenders of communism and of Stalin and of the Soviet Union will try to make it appear that Moscow or Russia was a better choice for us than Hitler, that we had to join forces, and that they're somehow okay because they fought Hitler. Well, when you have a couple of criminals fighting against each other, with Bloods and Crips, or Hell's Angels versus the Outlaws, or the Felix Cartel versus the Sinaloa Cartel, it's not because they don't see eye to eye, it's just that they are thugs battling over turf. After the war, of course, Marxist-Leninism was put into place in China. Communism ruled there. We saw a repeat of the Bolshevik Revolution, attack on religion. Ignatius Cardinal Kung was imprisoned for more than 2 decades, tortured. He was just one of many clergy, Catholic, Protestant, Confucian, Buddhist, Muslim, who were tortured and murdered by the communists in power there. But why are we talking about all of that? That was then. This is now. That was before the collapse of communism, before China became capitalist, before Russia became capitalist. Right now, we see President Obama and President Putin, they're making nice together here. And there he is with Communist China's President Xi Jinping. It's all happiness and smiles. And in fact, it's been that way for quite a while. There was George Bush and Putin. He even called him Pootie. They were great buddies. Here they are, very good friends, and also with the Chinese. They're out there with Hu Jintao. So all is well with the world. Why are we concerned about this? After all, China and Russia have been incorporated into BRICS, APEC, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, IMF, World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the UN, the G8, the G10, the G20, the European Union, more and more into NATO. Isn't that a good thing? Many of our fellow citizens think it is. That's what the media has been telling them. They're becoming more like us. Is that true? Well, on the surface, there are some things that we have to admit there have been some changes. However, we don't have time to go into all the detail here. In the remainder of my time, I'm going to show you a number of things that you can verify for yourself and you can use to verify with others to show them that, no, we are in one of the most perilous times the world has ever known. Now, the danger from the Marxist-Leninist communist regimes is far worse than it was at any time previously. As just one example, and we could go into this in great detail, it's the increased open cooperation between Moscow and Beijing, Russia and China. And that's evidencing itself in their combined war games. And that's just one small example. They have increased all of their trade, their technology transfers, their military transfers, their energy cooperation, education, and in their joint subversion and support of terrorism around the world. Now, I do not think that anyone can really understand what is happening in this sphere without being aware of this man, KGB defector Anatoly Golitsyn. These are two of his books, New Lies for Old, which came out in 1984, and The Perestroika Deception, which came out in 1995. As far as we know, he is still alive. He has been in deep hiding. Anatoly Golitsyn worked in the KGB, in the most secret part of the KGB, where they devised long-term strategy, global strategy, decades in advance. And he wrote in his books about precisely all of those things that are happening today. He wrote about them decades earlier. He said, we had set up plans to collapse communism, to have all these splits within communism, to have all these phony parties that would give the appearance of democracy and of human rights. We would be able to have control, the same kind of police state control, by turning many of the KGB guys into independent operators. They would now become mafia bosses and oligarchs. And then, when they took out opposition people that the government wanted them to, they could blame it on capitalism. They'd say, well, see, that's what happens when you change and you have this Wild West free enterprise. We don't have any stability anymore, and all of these this terrible crime and chaos is going on in Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev is seen here with Putin at a 2004 German-Russian summit in Germany. Gorbachev, who pretended to abolish the KGB, remains a key Kremlin operative, helping Putin sell the new reformed image of Russia to the West. Sometimes he criticizes Putin, sometimes Putin criticizes him, but they really are working together the whole time. And I have been to many of, in addition to the United Nations, to Gorbachev's State of the World Forum, his Gorbachev Foundation programs, where all of the big movers and shakers of business and think tanks and academe come together and presidents and prime ministers, et cetera, to help build what he's calling for a new world order. We've quoted Gorbachev many times from his own books, even though he at some various times has said he's no longer a communist. He subsequently comes out and says, we are moving on the path of communism, of Marxism, Leninism. We shall not depart from it. He's made many statements like that, and it's clear from from what he is doing with those who are in power that that is precisely the plan. Robert Buchar, who is a Czech defector, a filmmaker and author and professor of cinematography, has come out with a very good video called The Collapse of Communism, The Untold Story, and the book that accompanies it, And Reality Be Damned. At the New American, this is our online edition. The New American is a print magazine, but we also put up anywhere from 10 to 20 articles each day on our website, thenewamerican.com. And we've had many there showing. This here is President Medvedev. Now that symbolism behind him, we didn't put that in there. He was standing in front of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, that old symbolism. We see there all the time in the communist publications that the media that Putin controls, that they're constantly bringing back the Red Star, the hammer and the sickle, all of the communist propaganda into their own controlled media. Some of you may recall this book from the 1960s, Communism as I Know It, by Father Vladimir Kozina, a wonderful priest, a wonderful gentleman. He's in his late 90s now, a very good friend of mine. I go see him often, and I videotaped him. We have some videotapes of him online. This is him now. He's a wonderful priest. His family in Slovenia, which was part of Yugoslavia, was martyred by the communists. They were after him because he was a seminarian at the time. They came, they killed his mother, his father, two of his brothers. He escaped. He's in the United States now. I will be seeing him again shortly. And we have some videos coming out of him. But he is one of many people who follow things very closely, not just in Russia, but in his native Slovenia. And he points out, for instance, that Zoran Jankovic, the mayor of Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia, everyone knows he was a former communist and KGB guy. Father Kozina says, look, he still is. He named the main street in Ljubljana for communist dictator Tito. And he can run through a whole list of things that are happening there, and not only him, but the president, the prime minister, and many of the other people holding office. We see that throughout all of these former communist countries. In various articles, I've gone through just about every country in the former Soviet Union and many of those around the world that are supposedly no longer communist. And what do we see? In all the positions of power, executive, legislative, judicial, military, regulatory, police powers, the communists still are in power, so that any freedom they allow, any amount of human rights that they allow, are always reversible. That can always be taken away at any time. And we see this, for instance, here. Here's Ferenc Gyurcsány, Hungary's 6th prime minister. And he was a leader of the Communist Youth League. He then, like so many of the other communist leaders, was made into an instant millionaire. Was he a brilliant businessman? Did he invent something or come up with some great new service or product? No. The communists, who controlled all of the state assets, made him a millionaire. And then he became prime minister. And what did he do as prime minister? Well, among many things, he appointed this former communist KGB-trained general Zandor Labork to be head of, yes, NATO's intelligence. A KGB general put in charge of intelligence at NATO. How did he do that? Well, because Hungary had the rotating presidency, because now they were no longer communists, they were welcomed into NATO, and we've seen this over and over again. The United Nations. This is a special issue that we did on the United Nations, on the brink of becoming a world government. This is a particularly good issue because inside we have a fold-out map of the world showing in rather frightening detail all of these agencies of the United Nations and where they have set up headquarters, world headquarters, regional headquarters, national headquarters, all around the world with thousands and thousands of bureaucrats. They've actually already put in place the makings of a world government. And you can go on that site, and it's interactive. You can peel off layer after layer and see what all these different places are. This is a little more of a close-up. If we had time, I would show you why that should be of concern, no matter even if they were putting angels in charge. But are they putting angels in charge? Well, who is this gentleman, if I could use the term so loosely? Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping. And who is he? He's the undersecretary at the United Nations, right-hand man to Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General. And you see him here at the Earth Summit Rio Plus 20 last summer in Rio de Janeiro. He was the head of the whole summit, pushing the communist Marxist-Leninist version of sustainable development. That is, total government control over all resources, over all air, water, land, food, etc., in the name of protecting the environment. He, of course, is one of those who thinks that Tiananmen Square massacre was a wonderful thing. He publicly endorses that. He's a very vicious man. He is just one of innumerable communists, Marxist-Leninists who are running the United Nations. As I said, I've been going to the United Nations for many years. I've been in this pagan temple in the United Nations quite a number of times, the UN Meditation Room. This is going to be the center of their world religion. I've been to their world religion summits before, and we've written about that and done videos on that. None of this is surprising when one reflects on the fact that the man most responsible for helping launch the United Nations in our government was Alger Hiss, a Soviet agent. He was a Soviet spy working for Stalin in our State Department. There you see him shaking the hand of President Harry Truman. He was also right there before that with FDR. But he wasn't alone. He had all of this help. He helped put all of these other Soviet agents in the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco. Solomon Adler, Abram Silverman, Nathan Silvermaster, Lawrence Duggan, William Taylor, Noel Field, etc., John Carter Vincent. One of the most important ones, and very relevant to us today, was Harry Dexter White. He was a Soviet agent, architect of the Bretton Woods and the International Monetary Fund. He was the one who put the International Monetary Fund together. The International Monetary Fund is having these meetings every month and these big things to decide the fate of our planet economically. And we had been reporting for decades, as had many other solid congressmen and other conservatives, that Harry Dexter White, the evidence was overwhelming that he was a Soviet agent. That was a given. His supporters always denied that, but now just in the last few months, finally 45, 50 years later, it's here you see from the Daily Mail, revealed the banker who shaped the modern financial world after World War II was a Soviet spy who wanted America to become communist. Well, geez, folks, it's only 60 years late, but at least they finally got it. One of the very momentous things that he did, an earth-shattering thing which he did as in the U.S. Treasury Department, was to turn China communist. And how did he do that? by betraying Chiang Kai-shek, who is a Christian general, a heroic warrior, a faithful ally. But Harry Dexter White and the Communists and the Treasury Department and the State Department cut off the aid at the critical time when they were also giving aid to the Communists, to Mao Zedong, and pushed China, on all those millions of people, into the Communist camp. These are a couple of the books that I've written on the United Nations over the years, which goes into that in much more detail. One of the things that we're told in this new era that we're in is that, well, gee, look around. Here's the Forbes 100 list. And some of the top capitalists in the world now are these billionaire Russian entrepreneurs like Mikhail Prokhorov. And he doesn't look anything like those old dour, stolid communists of the Brezhnev era. No, he's a very bright young guy. He bounces around. He's a playboy. He has yachts and helicopters and planes. Billions of dollars. He owns, of course, the New Jersey Nets. I had an article on him clear back at the time when he started, Dangerous Connections, the NBA and the KGB. He's a KGB guy. He was put in power by Putin. All of these oligarchs, these Russian billionaires, have been made instant billionaires by Putin, by Yeltsin, by the Kremlin Marxist-Leninist masters to serve a purpose. Same with Vladimir Potanin, billionaire. Here you see him with Putin. He's now one of the wealthiest oligarchs. The same with Roman Abramovich, Russian billionaire. There's one of his yachts. He has a bigger one than that now. Same with Alexander Lebedev, former communist, former KGB officer, a Russian billionaire, lives in London. He bought the London Evening Standard and the Independent newspapers. All of these oligarchs and all of these other so-called entrepreneurs have been given an entree into our society and the highest levels of our society, of our business, cultural, economic, and many of them military, because many of them are in high technology, that they could have never dreamed of during the Cold War. They are welcomed onto the boards of all of the major corporations and banks. That is inviting the enemy right into your vitals. Now, if any of them get ideas and don't go along with Putin and company, this is what happens to them. Former billionaire oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once the richest man in Russia, he's now behind bars. Boris Berezovsky and Mogilevich and others are dead, of course, gunned down, most likely by Putin's KGB FSB. Some of you may get your gas or your petrol from Lukoil. We never could have had a major Soviet company like this in control of so much of our energy back during the Cold War. Now they're all over the place. While we have restrictions on our own domestic gas and oil so that we become dependent upon Russia for that. The same all over Europe. This is a commercial, which I was going to play for you, but the video isn't working. It's just a 30-second commercial. I was recently in Europe, in Switzerland and Italy and France, and this is a commercial on television for Gazprom, the UEFA championships. That's the big Super Bowl of soccer every year. It's the biggest sporting event, 360 million viewers at the 2012 game, and they have this big commercial. Well, they're always running on there for Gazprom. What is Gazprom? It is the Russian gas monopoly, multi-billion, one of the largest energy cartels in the world. It's run by Putin and his oligarchs, and they are, of course, now legitimized throughout all of Europe, and many of the media are dependent upon their revenue, and we see this with many of their companies. The this is another one, Igor Sechin. He's a KGB, GRU, FSB veteran. He's known as the Darth Vader of Russia. He's Putin's henchman. He is very much feared. He is the chairman of Rosneft, which is Russia's state oil monopoly. So he's a billionaire. Chairman of United Shipping Corporation. So you see, what we're seeing here is very important to realize, is that we are seeing a recapitulation of the new economic policy, the NEP, Lenin's new economic policy. This happened once before, ladies and gentlemen. Most people are unaware of this. From 1921 to 1930, Lenin realized that his communist society wasn't working. They couldn't produce anything. He said, we need Western help. We need the technology. We need to get manufacturing plants in here. We need capital. We need science. We need engineers. And so he launched a new program. He says, we're not communist anymore. We're a kind of a capital, he called it state capitalism. We're a state capitalist now. We welcome Western capitals to come in here. And they did. Ford, GM, GE, Fiat, all the major companies rushed into Russia. It's all been cataloged in great detail in over 1,000 pages, about 1,500 pages of 3 volumes by Professor Anthony Sutton, Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. He goes epic by epic, and he shows how every single one of the weapon systems and critical production facilities in Stalin's Soviet Union and Brezhnev's and Khrushchev's and whatnot, all came directly from technology from the United States and Europe. He then summarized those in these books, National Suicide, Military Aid to the Soviet Union, and The Best Enemy Money Can Buy. He pointed out that the top leadership of China's Communist Party have consistently, for the past 3 decades, stated that they are using Lenin's NEP model to get the technology, hardware, knowledge, training, and capital to build the Marxist-Leninist state. They are using capitalism to build communism. Now, on the domestic front, people say, well, you know, we don't have the Communist Party here in the United States, the CPUSA, they hardly exist anymore. Well, during the 1970s and early part of the 80s, I did a lot of undercover work in the Communist Party USA, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, the Trotskyite Socialist Workers' Party, as well as a number of terrorist groups affiliated with them here in the United States. All of those activists and agents are still here in the United States, but they have adopted new names. Now they call themselves progressives. They've come up with different Marxist labels, and they call themselves communitarians. Communitarianism is the new soft communism, and its leading apostle is Amitai Etzioni. These are 2 of his books. He's a former terrorist who now says he's not communist, but he admires communists, and he goes along with a lot of their objectives. But had some very interesting things to say. He said in the Jerusalem Post, quote, "There is no philosophy that better describes Obama's position than communitarianism." And he said, quote, "In my wildest dreams during the 18 years of championing communitarianism, I did not expect a presidential candidate to be as strongly identified with this political philosophy as Obama is." Now, I don't have time to do a whole thing on communitarianism and Amitai Etzioni, but if you will check into that, you will see that the whole term communitarianism came from the Communist Propaganda Project. That was the actual name of it before they changed the name to communitarianism. Now here's another expert. This is Maoist communist Van Jones, who was President Obama's green job czar for a short time. He is a communitarian, and he says of Obama, quote, "He is a communitarian. I mean, you always have individual versus communitarianism as a part of the American story." And I think we've overbalanced the individualist direction, and I think he's trying to rebalance toward communitarianism. Obama, of course, is also a communitarian, as was his Secretary of State and erstwhile presidential rival, both of whom are disciples of this man, Saul Alinsky, who wrote this infamous tract, Rules for Radicals. And we see in the dedication page there a very revealing quote that the left is trying to dismiss and say it doesn't mean anything. But here's what Saul Alinsky, the pro-communist, Marxist leader of so many in the 60s and today, said. He said, quote, "Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical, the first radical known to man, who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer." We see this again and again, that many of these so-called atheists actually have this fixation with Satan, with Lucifer. Okay, so then we are told, well, what about 9/11 and terrorism? We need Putin. We need Hu Jintao. We need Russia. We need China to help us fight against terrorism. I've done a whole multi-hour series on this, showing, do we need help from Putin, from Russia, from China to fight Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri? Well, actually, I believe, the evidence is very strong, that these terrorists and so many others are actually clients, trained surrogates for China and Russia. Now, that was very obvious back in the 70s and 80s. The evidence was very strong when we had people like who were self-declared Marxist-Leninists like Yasser Arafat, who then later, when it became appropriate, decided to become a Muslim. But here we have a picture of him laying a wreath on Lenin's tomb in Moscow in 1974, and standing right behind him is his KGB control officer, Russian, Vasily Salmenakov. Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, here's a Zawahiri here, according to this KGB defector, Alexander Litvinenko, he's holding up a book there, Blowing Up Russia, were trained by Russia. He gives the details of when they went to the Soviet Union. Their cover was to be radical Muslims, to stir up, as Andropov, who was head of the KGB, said, we're going to turn 1 billion Muslims into our virus in the West. Without going into, we've written a lot about him, but you're probably more familiar with him after he was poisoned with that polonium poisoning, which was Putin's revenge against him, because he had come out in a press conference like this exposing the fact that Putin was actually behind, and the FSB, the KGB, were behind many of these terrorist events around the world. He and virtually all the other people who exposed this were killed. This is his widow, Marina Litvinenko, at an April 3, 2007 press conference in London, where she lives. Those are pictures of him before and after his poisoning. This is another victim, Anna Politkovskaya, Russia's best-known investigative journalist. She was a relentless foe of Putin and his terror war. She exposed many of the things showing the KGB, FSB hand behind many of these so-called Islamic terrorists. And she was, of course, murdered. Hamas is having a press conference here in Moscow. Now, they're supposedly a radical Islamic group, but their headquarters is in Moscow. Here's Hamas leader, Khaled Mashal, in Moscow. I'm just going to race through this real quickly, give a couple more examples. One of the most notorious arms suppliers to the terrorists around the world is this man, Victor Bout, a former KGB GRU arms smuggler known as the Merchant of Death, the Lord of War. This is how it works, folks. In the old days, the Kremlin had to hide its connections to all of the terrorist groups by working through several layers. Now they just say, oh, well, he's an independent operator. We don't have any control over him. He's a businessman. He's just taking all these arms all over the world. He's stirring up all this chaos. They create the poison and the antidote in the same factory. After they create all of the chaos, then they say, hey, we can come help you. We'll help you get this terrorism under control. We've written about this quite a bit in the New American Magazine. You might not have seen yesterday, this is the op-ed in the New York Times by Vladimir Putin. And it's a plea for caution from Russia. So here, Syria was built into a communist state under Hafez al-Assad and now his son Bashar al-Assad. The Soviets provided him with all his weapons. They also have been providing the folks that are attacking him with a lot of weapons because if we had time, we'd go into how this dynamic works in many cases. They oftentimes throw out their own guys and put in somebody new if it's going to help advance the big picture. But what do we have happening here? Here's the head of Russia posing as the man of peace. And most of what he says here, I would have to agree with. We shouldn't be going to war in Syria, but he has a different motive for this and a different end game and a different objective with what he's promoting here. And he says, he ends his op-ed with, again, another fig leaf to make it appear that he is a Christian. He says, we all ask the blessings of God. We all want to live in peace. So let's do the Christian thing. And it's, again, putting forward that fiction, that lie, that the communists in power in the Kremlin, and yes, they are still in power there as they are in Beijing, are somehow Christians. And that's what we see now with the deception that is fooling many people, particularly Christians, about Putin's support for Christianity and his rejection, he says, of homosexuality. Well, of course, everybody, we're all glad that somebody's standing up and saying, no, we're not going to have gay marriage, we're not going to have homosexual marriage in Russia, but what is the reason for doing that? All of the communist groups are supporting it in the West. They want to destroy all the moral fiber and Christianity in the West. But in communist society, they know you cannot allow perversion like that to run rampant. If you're going to have a controlled society, you have to keep certain things under control. So there's nothing moral about it or anything Christian about what he is advocating, either in this plea for peace or in his stand against homosexual marriage. It is part of a larger deceptive plan. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it is part of the conquest through convergence. They are accomplishing now far more in their plans of convergence, economic, social, political, spiritual convergence, than they ever did during the Cold War when it was open confrontation. And again, it brings us back to the conflict of our age, the cosmic conflict between heaven and hell. And right now, it is, as it was in 1917, Fatima versus the revolution. Thank you very much.
Very well done. As usual.
Sono giunta per avvertire i fedeli che è necessario che facciano ammenda e chiedano perdono per i loro peccati. non offendano più nostro Signore, che è già molto offeso. Nell'ultima apparizione del 13 settembre 1917, la Madonna mostrò in silenzio lo scapolare del Carmelo, un gesto che indica il suo desiderio che quello stesso scapolare venga indossato da tutti. La Madonna di Fatima ha detto: «Se le mie richieste non verranno esaudite, la Russia diffonderà i suoi orrori in tutto il mondo, provocando guerre e persecuzioni contro la Chiesa. I buoni saranno martirizzati. Il Santo Padre dovrà soffrire molto. Varie nazioni saranno annientate». Pregate, pregate molto e sacrificatevi per i peccatori. Molte anime vanno all'inferno perché non vi è chi si sacrifichi e preghi per loro. Nell'ultima apparizione del 13 settembre 1917, la Madonna mostrò in silenzio lo scapolare del Carmelo, Un gesto che indica il suo desiderio che quello stesso scapolare venga indossato da tutti. Pregate, pregate molto e sacrificatevi per i peccatori. Molte anime vanno all'inferno perché non vi è chi si sacrifichi e preghi per loro. La Madonna di Fatima ha detto: «Se le mie richieste non verranno esaudite, la Russia diffonderà i suoi orrori in tutto il mondo, provocando guerre e persecuzioni contro la Chiesa. I buoni saranno martirizzati. Il Santo Padre dovrà soffrire molto. Varie nazioni saranno annientate».
La Beata Vergine ci ha fornito un modo per ottenere la pace nel mondo, perché solo lei può aiutarci. In troppi, tuttavia, non si rendono conto della portata di queste parole. Forse ritengono che non sia accaduto niente di veramente drammatico e che non bisogna preoccuparsene troppo. Questo è dovuto al fatto che i giornalisti, i commentatori, i cosiddetti opinion leader della stampa e della televisione, in altre parole coloro che avrebbero il dovere di informarci, in realtà sono solo al soldo del nemico e comunque non fanno proprio il loro lavoro. E non ci dicono che dal momento in cui abbiamo rifiutato il messaggio di Fatima, perché l'umanità questo ha fatto, ha disprezzato e rifiutato Fatima, vi sono stati 1.680.000.000 di morti violente. Ripeto, 1 miliardo, cioè 1 seguito da 9 zeri, più altri 686 milioni di persone che sono morte a causa del fatto che abbiamo ignorato la Madonna di Fatima. Spero che questa cifra vi permetta di comprendere la portata spaventosa della decisione di ignorare la Madonna di Fatima. Sono 95 anni che l'umanità si permette di ignorarla e abbiamo già pagato un prezzo tremendo. Ma questo potrebbe raddoppiarsi, addirittura triplicarsi negli anni a venire se continueremo impunemente ad ignorarla. Solo pochi mesi fa l'umanità ha raggiunto l'incredibile numero di 7 miliardi di abitanti. Le Sacre Scritture ci dicono che a un certo punto, tra l'1 e i 2/3 della popolazione mondiale verranno spazzati via da una guerra mondiale. Francamente, se questo non ci desta dal nostro torpore, non so cosa potrebbe riuscirci. Forse qualche giornalista che ne parli in diretta sulla CNN? Oppure un articolo del New York Times? Non lo so, ma quel che so per certo è che non abbiamo preso Fatima abbastanza sul serio. Le nostre responsabilità e i nostri doveri quotidiani ci portano via gran parte della giornata e tra studio, lavoro e famiglia le nostre 24 ore spesso volano via e non ci resta molto altro da fare. È ovvio che il Papa e i Vescovi abbiano una vita assolutamente densa di incontri e cose da fare, per carità, ma questo non può essere una scusa, né per loro né tantomeno per noi, poiché tutti noi dovremo mettere Fatima al primo posto tra le nostre priorità. Non esiste al mondo nulla di più serio, di più importante, di più urgente del messaggio della Madonna di Fatima. Alcuni anni fa ricevetti una lettera da parte di un vescovo piuttosto anziano, se non erro della diocesi di Ottawa in Canada. In quella sua lettera il vescovo in sostanza mi diceva una cosa del tipo: «Padre Gruner, se lei non alzasse così tanto la voce e non ci urlasse contro, forse cominceremo a prestare attenzione a cosa dice». Ecco cosa risposi a quel vescovo: «Eccellenza, la ringrazio moltissimo per il suo interesse e i suoi consigli e le sue preoccupazioni. Ora però, se potesse cortesemente spiegarmi come posso migliorare nel mio lavoro e attirare l'attenzione dei vescovi senza alzare troppo la voce, ne sarei veramente grato. Io odio alzare la voce e odio attirare l'attenzione su me stesso, ma non sembrano esservi alternative per diffondere questo messaggio. Vedete, i numeri non mentono. Ieri abbiamo partecipato alla Marcia per la Vita qui a Roma, e questo perché non possiamo tacere dinanzi alla spaventosa piaga dell'aborto. Sin dal 1975 le statistiche parlano di oltre 1.300.000 aborti. E con le guerre si aggiungono altri 78 milioni di morti, per non parlare degli assassini di Stato, non solo in Russia ma anche in Cina, per arrivare agli oltre 230 milioni di morti. Si tratta di una cifra catastrofica che ci induce a ritenere, come fece Papa San Pio X, che si stiano avvicinando i giorni che precedono la venuta dell'Anticristo. L'enormità di queste cifre è secondo solo all'incredibile miopia di chi non vuol vedere queste cose, che stanno accadendo adesso intorno a noi. Fu proprio il cardinale Ratzinger a dire che il messaggio di Fatima si può trovare nelle scritture e che stiamo vivendo il periodo predetto dall'Apocalisse. Anche se è comprensibile distrarsi a causa delle informazioni fuorvianti che ci vengono date dalla stampa e dalla televisione, questi eccidi continuano a accadere ogni giorno. E la loro portata è tale che ormai è innegabile che se non proprio nei giorni dell'Apocalisse o nei giorni che precedono la venuta dell'Anticristo, stiamo sicuramente vivendo in un'epoca che non ha precedenti nella storia dell'umanità. Pensiamo alla Chiesa Cattolica. L'unico altro momento della sua storia che possa paragonarsi alla crisi attuale risale all'epoca dell'eresia ariana, quando il 90% dei vescovi di allora cadde preda di quell'eresia. Erano rimasti solo 3-4 vescovi a combattere gli eretici, e il più grande tra loro, Sant'Attanasio, fu addirittura scomunicato dal Papa nel 357. Ovviamente la sua era una scomunica solo teorica, perché come ci ha spiegato San Tommaso e come la Chiesa ha sempre insegnato, la legge non è fatta da ciò che dice il legislatore, ma essa è l'ordinato della ragione ed è per il bene comune. La legge della Chiesa afferma che nessuno può essere punito se non ha commesso un errore o un crimine. Quindi, poiché Attanasio rimase fedele alla vera fede cattolica, difendendola a oltranza, come era suo dovere in quanto fedele vescovo, non avrebbe dovuto essere punito. E non era colpevole malgrado il Papa di allora avesse emesso sentenza di scomunica. Successivamente, infatti, Papa Liberio si pentì del suo gesto, ma egli fu il primo Papa a non essere canonizzato sin dai tempi di San Pietro. È bene tenere a mente che non dobbiamo avere timore del giudizio dell'uomo, se siamo dalla parte di Dio. È un principio che non dobbiamo mai dimenticare, così come il fatto che la profezia nella Chiesa ha una funzione ben precisa, una funzione che non avrà mai fine e che va rispettata, così come vanno rispettati gli uffici apostolici. Come ci insegna San Paolo nella lettera agli Efesini, infatti, la Chiesa è costruita sulla base degli apostoli, ma anche dei profeti. Quindi non soltanto sui primi, e pertanto il ruolo della profezia è fondamentale. Le scritture ci dicono che dobbiamo estinguere lo spirito e non dobbiamo disprezzare le profezie, ma che dobbiamo esaminare ogni cosa e ritenere il bene, astenendoci da ogni specie di male. Ecco perché sono decenni che promuovo il messaggio di Fatima, non solo perché esso è l'unico tra tutti i messaggi mariani, ma anche perché è stato approvato dalla Chiesa. Durante un suo discorso qui a Roma diversi anni fa, padre Joseph Saint-Marie, e cioè colui che scrisse il discorso pronunciato da Giovanni Paolo II a Fatima nel 1982, disse giustamente che il ruolo della gerarchia è quello di giudicare ed esaminare se un profeta affermi o meno la verità. Ma una volta che la gerarchia ha riconosciuto che quel messaggio proviene da Dio, allora il Papa e i vescovi sono obbligati a seguirlo, non per obbedienza al profeta, bensì a Dio che usa quel profeta per comunicare con loro. Questo dovere è intrinsecamente legato al loro ruolo di pastori nella Chiesa. Non sono certo io a dire al Papa quel che deve fare, è la Madonna di Fatima a farlo. Io mi limito a spiegare cosa significano le parole della Madonna, a rispondere alle obiezioni dei teologi o di altri che non hanno avuto il tempo di rifletterci abbastanza. Ma torniamo a quel 1917, quando la Madonna dette all'umanità un messaggio per ottenere la pace. Le era stato chiesto di aiutarci e così fece, dandoci un rimedio per ottenere la pace nel mondo, che però abbiamo ostinatamente rifiutato nei successivi 95 anni. Nel 1931, durante l'apparizione di Riangio, Nostro Signore fornì a Sor Lucia, o meglio al Papa e ai Vescovi per mezzo della religiosa, una vera e propria lezione di storia. Disse infatti: «Fa sapere ai miei ministri, dato che continuano a seguire l'esempio del re di Francia nel ritardare l'esecuzione del mio ordine, che come il re di Francia anche loro lo seguiranno nella sciagura». Di che esempio stava parlando? In questa apparizione Nostro Signore fece riferimento ai re di Francia. Il 17 giugno 1689, per mezzo di Santa Margherita Maria, Dio aveva ordinato al re di Francia di consacrare il suo paese al Sacro Cuore di Gesù. Sin da allora i tre re che si succedettero al trono della Francia ignorarono la profezia di Santa Margherita Maria e l'ordine che attraverso di lei aveva ricevuto dal Signore. Persino mentre era ancora in vita Margherita Maria Aloque venne riconosciuta come una santa. I suoi contemporanei erano a conoscenza della sua santità, quindi i re di Francia, per aver ignorato la sua profezia, pagarono con la loro vita. Il 17 giugno 1789, infatti, esattamente 100 anni dopo la richiesta di Nostro Signore, il re di Francia venne privato della sua autorità da parte del Terzo Stato. 3 settimane più tardi, con la presa della Bastiglia, avrebbe avuto inizio la Rivoluzione francese del 21 gennaio 1793. Re Luigi XVI sarebbe stato ghigliottinato dai rivoluzionari. Nostro Signore ha fatto un legame assolutamente incontrovertibile. Fa sapere ai miei ministri, dato che seguono l'esempio del re di Francia nel ritardare l'esecuzione del mio ordine, che come il re di Francia anche loro lo seguiranno nella sciagura. Fino ad oggi i papi e i vescovi hanno ignorato o comunque ritardano l'esecuzione di quell'ordine divino, accampando una scusa dopo l'altra. Penso ormai di averle sentite tutte nella mia carriera, ma come abbiamo già abbondantemente dimostrato con le nostre conferenze e le nostre pubblicazioni, quelle scuse fanno acqua da tutte le parti. Non c'è alcun motivo che impedisca la consacrazione della Russia, ma purtroppo fino ad ora hanno scelto di non farla. Ci troviamo davanti a un bivio. Nessuno può ordinare al Santo Padre di fare alcunché, tantomeno il sottoscritto. Solo il Papa ha infatti l'autorità di ordinare alla Chiesa di compiere un atto simile. Questo non vuol dire, tuttavia, che i fedeli non abbiano delle carte da giocare, ma di questo in particolare parleremo in un altro discorso. Ad ogni modo, il messaggio di Fatima non riguarda solo il Papa. Come ha detto proprio Benedetto XVI mentre si recava a Fatima, nel terzo segreto si predice la passione della Chiesa e una persecuzione del Santo Padre. Ma il Papa fa parte della Chiesa, quindi non è solo lui a soffrirne le conseguenze, ma tutta la Chiesa cattolica.
La Madonna disse a Suor Lucia: a tutti coloro che il primo sabato del mese, per 5 mesi consecutivi, si confesseranno e riceveranno la Santa Comunione, reciteranno il rosario e mi terranno compagnia per 15 minuti, meditando sui 15 misteri del rosario, in spirito di riparazione, io prometto di assisterli nell'ora della loro morte con tutte le grazie necessarie per la salvezza delle loro anime. La Madonna sa come far avvenire i miracoli e sono sicura che troverà il modo affinché il Papa guardi questo DVD e ascolti in prima persona cosa hanno da dire i fedeli in merito alle condizioni in cui si trovano oggi il mondo e la Chiesa. Troppi governi e troppi religiosi, è triste a dirsi, lo so, ma è così, inclusi molti sacerdoti, parroci, vescovi e persino cardinali del Vaticano, non stanno rispondendo con la dovuta serietà e la necessaria prontezza a questa malvagità che minacciano la vita e l'anima di innumerevoli persone in tutto il mondo. Santo Padre, il vostro gregge è disperato, vulnerabile e confuso dinanzi a questi pericoli che minacciano di portar via la vita e soprattutto l'anima di tanti fedeli. Siamo profondamente preoccupati per il futuro dei nostri figli e ancor più per il loro benessere spirituale. Il mondo è scoraggiato e si unisce all'unisono in un grido disperato. Quale speranza ci rimane? Santo Padre, la speranza per il mondo intero è nelle vostre mani, perché soltanto voi potete salvare l'umanità obbedendo alla santa richiesta della Madre di Dio, la Beata Vergine Maria, la quale a Fatima ha detto: solo io posso aiutarvi. La Madonna ha chiesto che il Santo Padre, insieme a tutti i vescovi del mondo, compiano nello stesso giorno e alla stessa ora una consacrazione collegiale della Russia al Cuore Immacolato di Maria. Si tratta di una preghiera di soli 5 minuti. Santo Padre, non vi preoccupate delle ripercussioni di questo gesto o delle minacce che vi intimano di non farlo. Abbiate fede nella promessa della Madonna. Il paradiso non commette errori. Nostro Signore ha compiuto il grande miracolo del sole e ha fatto sì che le profezie di Fatima si compissero tutte proprio affinché voi, santità, poteste credere in esse ed obbedire quindi alle richieste della Madonna di Fatima. Affidatevi completamente alla guida amorevole che vi offre la Madonna di Fatima. Affidatevi alla sua materna promessa e protezione, come giustamente voi ricordate ai fedeli di tutto il mondo. La Madonna ha chiesto la consacrazione della Russia, non del mondo. Ed ella non gioca con le parole. Vi prego, Santo Padre, di prendere seriamente e letteralmente le parole della Madonna. Non possiamo cambiare una formula preparata da nostro Signore, che il cielo ci ha fatta avere per mezzo della Beata Vergine Maria. Santo Padre, quando battezzate un bambino di nome Giovanni Paolo, voi non battezzate di certo tutti i bambini del mondo, perché quel battesimo non sarebbe valido. Santo Padre, Quando consacrate la chiesa della Madonna di Fatima, voi non consacrate tutte le chiese del mondo, perché quella consacrazione non sarebbe valida. Senza nominare specificatamente e precisamente il nome di quel bambino oppure il nome di quella chiesa, nessuno dei due sarà stato consacrato in modo efficace. Allo stesso modo, e a maggior ragione, non è possibile consacrare la Russia al cuore immacolato di Maria se non la si menziona per nome durante tale consacrazione. Consacrare tutte le nazioni del mondo non equivale a scegliere in particolar modo la Russia, preservandola e consacrandola specificatamente al Signore. Consacrare tutte le nazioni del mondo non equivale a scegliere in particolar modo la Russia, preservandola e consacrandola specificatamente al Signore. Questa consacrazione non è mai avvenuta e non può avere quindi gli effetti promessi. Santo Padre, voi, meglio di tutti noi, siete a conoscenza di questa verità. Noi fedeli cattolici guardiamo a voi per essere protetti e guidati contro le forze diaboliche che attentano alla nostra anima tutti i giorni della nostra vita. Per questo non riusciamo a capire come mai non abbiate ancora voluto compiere la consacrazione della Russia. A secondo di quanto detto dalla Madonna, l'ordine impartito dal Signore di consacrare la Russia è stato ritardato già troppo a lungo ed il tempo a nostra disposizione sta per scadere. La Madonna ha offerto l'unica soluzione possibile, ma questa può realizzarsi soltanto grazie a voi, Santità. Ogni giorno di ritardo nel compiere questa consacrazione comporta la perdita di un numero sempre maggiore di anime e di vite umane. Oggi centinaia di migliaia di persone vengono perseguitate, torturate e uccise a causa della propria fede in Cristo. Per favore, Santo Padre, non prolungate questo stato di cose, proteggete il vostro gregge, vi imploriamo di consacrare la Russia prima che sia troppo tardi per tutti noi. Lo diciamo con amore e devozione nei vostri confronti, Santità, anche alla luce di ciò che raffigura la visione del terzo segreto di Fatima. Santo Padre, noi preghiamo quotidianamente per voi. Salvateci, salvate i nostri figli e salvate anche voi stesso dagli orribili castighi profeziati da Gesù e da Maria se non procederemo al più presto ad obbedire alle richieste della Madonna di Fatima. Santo Padre, è venuto il momento di dimostrare alla Madonna di Fatima il vostro totale affidamento e la vostra assoluta obbedienza ai suoi comandi. Grazie e che Dio vi benedica tutti.